Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I am Larry González, a founding principal of the Raben Group. The Raben Group is a nationwide public policy and public affairs firm, and I am really excited to have this panel of experts that I'm about to introduce to discuss the topic, No Community Left Behind, Ensuring Equitable Distribution of COVID-19 Relief. So the main question for this panel today, are COVID-19 relief efforts reaching communities that need them? Or are they making long-term gaps for underserved communities even wider? Now, before we get started, I think I should say to all of you out there that we can all appreciate that times are tough and we're doing our best with the technology. But as you've probably seen in your own working from home scenarios, sometimes things happen. Dog doo-doo, as one of my colleagues said. So please bear with me and us in the event that we have technological glitches. We're doing the best our can on our end. So to begin, I've heard some folks in the media opine and ask, why should we care about this specific community when all Americans are struggling? And we'll talk about this. But when the numbers for the Paycheck Protection Program are as abysmal as they are, with up to 90% of women and minority-owned small business shut out of the access to loans, all policymakers and Americans should really care about equal access. So I'm excited about this panel also because this group of folks you'll hear from is not just professionally accomplished, but can speak about their own experiences in dealing with public policy that oftentimes is developed without input from communities of color, while it often has the most disparate impact on these communities. But they're also forward-looking leaders, advocates, and one of our panelists documents and explores the intersection of politics and identity. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to introduce our panel individually with abbreviated bios. As I mentioned, their accomplishments form a very long list, and we need a lot longer than an hour together. If you'd like to learn more about them individually and the organizations they represent, you can go to the websites we'll be flashing below throughout the webcast. So first, I'd like to introduce Marie Argilagos. She is the president and CEO of Hispanics and Philanthropy, or HIP, because you have to have a cool acronym nowadays. Marie is guiding HIP with a bold vision to usher in a new generation of philanthropy that is for, by, and about the Latino community. Under her leadership as president and CEO, HIP has spearheaded rapid responses to the biggest challenges facing Latinos today. HIP is coordinating a regional response to the migration crisis in the US and Central America, supporting Puerto Rico's long-term recovery from Hurricane Maria, and investing in nonprofits to fight for an inclusive and accurate 2020 census, among many other critical efforts. Marie, welcome.
Thank you, Larry. You know us well, so I appreciate your inviting us.
What, you and I have known each other for almost 2 decades. I think you knew me when I had hair. So
yes, but thank you, the Raben Group, and thank everyone on the call. That you're here means that you care, and I thank you so much for that. It's so important. As Larry, as you mentioned, HIP is a network. We're 36 years old now, and we're a network of foundations, of individual donors and givers, donors that give thousands of dollars and donors that give $10, and also of nonprofits. And our work is really about reducing inequality and really helping for those that are most vulnerable. I think about our work as having 2 jobs. We're about raising awareness and the power and the promise of the Latino community. And we do that while we're also increasing investments so that we dismantle structural barriers and all of the systems that really are impeding our shared prosperity and equitable resource distribution, specifically from philanthropy. So the title of this session, which is No Community Left Behind, really fits well in what we're thinking about at HIP. As Latinos, we know that the pandemic did not create inequities, but actually revealed the inequities. And those of us that went through Hurricane Maria, as myself did, and others that went through Sandy, Katrina, any other disasters, know that the system is really skewed, and it's skewed from the start. And this is not only within philanthropy, where we can see that 1% of philanthropic dollars go to Latino communities, Latino-led led organizations, and that number has been persistent over the past 12 years. But we see that also in the business world. We see that, if, for example, access to capital, only 1% of dollars go to Latino communities. And we're seeing that with PPP right now, where about 3% of PPP dollars are going to communities of color as a whole. And so I'm glad that my colleagues will be talking about that a little bit later on. But this investment is cumulative, and it's really distressing. At HIP, we think about philanthropy as a whole. We know that foundations need to be accountable, transparent, and they need to do better. But we also understand that our own community has to also be able to provide into our own infrastructure and our own organizations. And so it's very concerning that we're about to wipe out a whole generation of wealth, because that means that our community will not be able to participate in giving within itself again. I've been talking a lot in the past 2 months, writing statements, and I've been talking a lot about the need for foundations to increase their payout. Now is the time to do something like that. I know that many foundations are very concerned about perpetuity, because many foundations want to continue their work for 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, for forever, if possible. But perpetuity also means that there is a lot more carefulness in how foundations spend their dollars. And that means that foundations are not spending as much as they could from their endowment. And that's a problem, because I think that we need to really make sure that we're helping the nonprofits and the business world as much as we can now. From my opinion, the strength of a foundation's grantees at the end of this crisis will be a much better measure of its significance. It'll be a much better measure than if you think about its endowment. If a foundation has $3 billion in its endowment, but has no grantees that are surviving, that is a travesty. And so we're talking about that a lot. We're also talking, and some of our listeners might have seen the New York Times article last week about Bridgesbrand's report, which shows that another travesty, that race and ethnicity is still a factor in who gets what funding. That is there's numbers now from Bridgesbrand's long report that shows that if you're Latina, if you're African American, if you're Native American, you're going to get fewer dollars, and then that jeopardizes your future. And so I hope that we can talk about this a little bit more later on.
For sure. Thank you so much, actually.
Thank you.
Ana Maria, and that particular point, I want to come back to that New York Times piece, because maybe it's a silver lining, maybe not, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Great.
Now I want to bring in Lisa Mensah to offer her perspective. Lisa is president and CEO of the Opportunity Finance Network, OFN, the nation's leading network of community development financial institutions, CDFIs. We're all about the acronyms today. OFN helps CDFIs leverage public funding with private investment from mainstream financial institutions, socially responsible investors, and philanthropic partners in underserved communities across America. Lisa joined OFN in March 2017. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Larry. Very wonderful to be with you. And thanks to the Raben Group for having this on a really important topic of not leaving communities behind. So I love it. You've already done the work of explaining our acronym of Community Development Financial Institutions. And really, you should think of us as community lenders, as strong community lenders with a mission to serve communities that have often been left behind by mainstream finance. So my network is over 300 institutions, and our borrowers are 85% of them are low income, 58% of them are people of color, 48% are women and 26% rural. And this is just quite different than mainstream finance. So you're having this topic today on who was left behind in this pandemic. And what I know is that one of the reasons we're seeing CDFIs now in the news is because people needed to turn to us because so many of the first responses weren't reaching the communities. I like to say that our CDFIs were the financial first responders in a time of crisis. Before the government even started having programs, CDFIs leaned in. They were the kind of, I call it capital plus. They're there with their capital, but with their energy and their technical assistance and their creativity and their flexibility. One of our members, the Black Business Investment Fund in Florida, BBIF, they created an emergency relief fund to offer their small businesses working capital loans with flexible rates. This is so important just at a time when those small businesses were facing one of the worst crises this country's ever seen. So this is what I think CDFIs offer at this moment. Sadly, most of the CDFIs in the first round of the Paycheck Protection Act were left out. And what that showed is that you can't actually reach the borrowers without reaching lenders. So here were all the borrowers, the nonprofits and the small businesses that needed these PPP loans, these forgivable loans from government. And yet for the first round, we were left out largely as lenders, and we were left out and beat out by the first come, first serve strategy. Thankfully, this got better in the second round. And in spite of the challenges, CDFIs were able to actually use this program. And I've got a slide that shows what CDFIs and minority depository institutions were able to do. And remember, we felt like we were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, but still, we made over $2 billion of PPP loans. And if you add our performance with that of the minority depository institutions, it's over $6 billion. So there's a bright light that when we're allowed to play and when we're supported in playing, we can do this. Our industry size is about $185 billion of assets under management. And before the crisis, we were sitting with a portfolio of small business loans of about $19 billion. But what we see now is how critical the kind of mission lenders are, not only in the moment of crisis, but also how we move forward. Now, the House just passed the HEROES Act. And in this, we were so relieved to see an emergency appropriation of $1 billion for the CDFI fund. This is the fund at Treasury that most understands CDFIs. It is 25 years old. And to have this kind of funding, it is not just an outlay. It is going to be leveraged. With every dollar a CDFI receives from the CDFI fund, they leverage it 12 times. So this kind of appropriation proposed in the HEROES Act will have a $12 billion impact at a minimum. And what happens when we use that money? We find private partners. Because you see, what CDFIs do is they use their capital to go and borrow more and use those funds to lend. And one silver linings, Larry, in this time has been a new partnership that we've announced with Google. And here is Google. We were talking with their Philanthropy, google.org, about a grant. And then they brought in the Google Treasury as well. So in addition to a $5 million grant, these partners put a $125 million loan fund and able to reach small businesses impacted by COVID. And Google didn't just do this with their with short-term money. They did it with 5 and 10-year money. So when we have things like the government's investment in the CDFI fund, and in this case, in a special emergency appropriation, we believe we're going to be able to reach private partners, other private partners, and begin to lend to those businesses, because we're the kind of mission lenders that you want on the ground to make sure that we don't leave those communities behind. The numbers of being shut out are tragic. And yet what we've also discovered in this time is who's really there. And if we're not in the game, we can't rebuild. So Larry, I thank you for letting us be part. We are actually here to fight for this capital to move to our communities, particularly low-income and minority communities. And that's
thank
what
you,
I
Lisa.
hope.
Thank you. I appreciate that perspective, particularly around the fight. You took us forward, and I want to bring in Noel Poyo, because when we talk about someone that has been in the fight, particularly in Washington, and the obstacles that are often presented to organizations like his in educating members of Congress about why this is all important. I'd love for him to speak about that. So let me introduce him real quick. Noel Andres Poyo is the Executive Director of NALCAD, the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders. His 20-year professional career has focused on integrating low-income people and immigrants into mainstream financial services and real estate sectors of our economy. He's played diverse roles in the implementation of socially motivated real estate and economic development projects valued over $1 billion. From 2015 to 2017, he advised Chair Yellen and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve as one of 15 members of the Fed's Community Advisory Council. He's testified before congressional committees and advises the executive leadership at some of the nation's largest banks as a member of their respective community advisory boards. Noel, thanks so much for joining us today.
Larry, I appreciate the opportunity and appreciate the opportunity to speak with, in the context of a panel as esteemed as this one. NALCAB it's a national network organization. It's the hub of a network of more than 120 mission-driven organizations working in urban and rural communities in 40 states, DC and Puerto Rico. And our organizations are doing things like building affordable housing and addressing gentrification, supporting small business growth with lending and technical support, providing financial counseling, home buyer counseling, credit building services, these sorts of things, right? We're concerned with the balance sheet, whether it's the balance sheet of our families, of our businesses, or really writ large of our community. And we have this vision to dramatically scale the flow of capital into our communities that can responsibly meet the asset building needs and opportunities that our communities and families represent. And I think this idea of responsibly meet not just the needs, but the opportunities, because that's what our community is, right? It's an opportunity, it's an investment. And our members include CDFIs, like Ms. Mensah was talking about, community development corporations, community-based organizations, community development credit unions, really diverse community-based organizations that take on different aspects of this challenge. And our mission is to strengthen the economy by advancing economic mobility in Latino communities. And so that mission has an underlying macroeconomic perspective. As I say, our overall economy will not move forward, strengthen, will not reach its potential if our Latino communities don't, if our African American communities don't, if all communities in this country don't, right? And this is, I think oftentimes when we have these discussions, Larry brought it up at the beginning, actually, this idea that, well, there are these communities over here that pobrecitos, we need to get them some dollars, but really, there's a conversation about the macroeconomy, and then there's this conversation about the poor people over there that we need to do something about. And the reality here is that the future of our economy, our future gross domestic product, our future global competitiveness relies on closing gaps that manifest, economic gaps that manifest in Latino and African American communities and others, right? And what we saw from the Great Recession was a great widening of those gaps. And it's very frustrating to see that process happening already as things have played out here in this economic crisis, in which, frankly, we're still in the early stages of. And so in thinking about who got access and why, and how is it that we solve these challenges as opposed to make them worse, we need to think, first have that macroeconomic context that says this is a real deal for all of us in this country, not just one community or another. We're all in this together. But we need to think about the channels for delivering the resources in an emergency, and then ongoing beyond that emergency. And we need to think about transparency and reporting so that we can actually judge whether resources are getting where they need to go. And these were some of the real flaws we saw in the Paycheck Protection Program. No one should be shocked that banks deployed money first to their best customers. We shouldn't be telling banks they did a terrible thing when we knew exactly how this would operate, right? The system was designed for that. And that's what we saw. The first round of PPP deployed capital extremely rapidly and to the preferred customers of our nation's banking system. And in the second round, the same thing was happening actually all in the first 5 days, a very rapid deployment, but it slowed down a great deal. We've now gotten to a point where only sort of the most vulnerable, the least, those with the least access are left, and so the deployment is happening much more slowly because indeed banks are not set up to serve that population well. And we have very little transparency and reporting about what's going on. And so NowCAB now is not just trying to facilitate access to the Paycheck Protection Program, but also doing grant making and lending to members of our network, and also have our policy advocacy work. We've published a Latino Economic Agenda, which is available on our website, which lays out a vision for moving forward with federal policy on these issues, and love to talk more about it. But Larry, thank you. Thank you.
For sure. No, thank you for those comments. And I do want to remind our audience that if they want to learn more about all of these leaders and the organizations that they are engaged in, we'll be continuing to put the ticker at the bottom with the websites. Thank you, I think, particularly for one of the points, Noel, that reporting matters, because that's the perfect segue here to Jamil. And Jamil has been out there documenting the realities that our community faces. So Jamil Smith is a senior writer at Rolling Stone, where he covers national affairs and culture. Throughout his career as a journalist and Emmy Award-winning television producer, he has explored the intersection of politics and identity, specializing in reported analysis and commentary about United States politics, social justice, and cultural identity. And I just, before you get started, Jamil, again, thank you for all of your efforts, and take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation, Larry. Thank you very much for having me. So as you mentioned, I cover politics and identity. What that means is that I cover race, gender, sexual identity, and how those all interact with our politics. And so being that I do that, I really do talk to a lot of people in my journalism who expect the kinds of outcomes that we've seen with the COVID crisis. And so when I wrote in early April, as I did, an article entitled "In the Horror Story, We Always Die First," frankly, I spoke from a standpoint, not just as a Black man who's grown up in America and understands that our life expectancy is considerably shorter than our white counterparts, but also from the standpoint of someone who has studied the numbers and understands that African Americans, as I wrote, are quite used to seeing our own die early, whether in real life or the movies. And now, as the world lives out its own horror story with the coronavirus pandemic, the one constant is Black death. The crisis is reacquainting the rest of America with our conspicuous morbidity. Now, this, of course, was at least feigned surprise with our president. He, that week, I wrote this article on April 10th. That week, he, sort of feigned surprise about the growing disparities in African-American deaths, and also, we should note, Latino and Indigenous deaths. And there really should have been no surprise on the part of the government or on the part of really any Americans throughout the country. We really could point to any number of causes for these numbers to be, emerging, anything from comorbidities that exist within African-American communities. And those comorbidities aren't necessarily something that come as a result of inherent genetics. They come as a result of environment. We often hear about the zip codes. Your life expectancy is tied to your zip code. And that's, frankly, it's not due simply to the fact that you maybe be living in a particular environment, breathing in certain air, but also you may be receiving a certain education. You may be in a food desert, which meaning that you may not have grocery stores or fresh produce available. And as Wired reported, anybody who's paying attention knows the gulf between the health statistics of white and Black Americans has existed for decades or really centuries. COVID-19 is just the latest manifestation of an old and ugly trend. So frankly, what we should be noting is that this is a problem that we could have been prepared for. This is a problem that we should have been prepared for. And right now, the CDC is reported as recently as a month ago that 33% of hospitalized patients were Black compared to 18% in the community. That's, so that's suggesting that's an overrepresentation of Black people among hospitalized patients. And at one point in Georgia, 80% of hospital beds were filled by Black Americans. So that's, frankly, that should be unacceptable, not just to Black Americans, but to all Americans. And we need to, frankly, work on creating an America that not just, is serving, white Americans, I think, to their satisfaction, but to the satisfaction of Black Americans, at least in terms of, the hospitals. And we were looking at a medical situation where Black folks are raised. I know that I got these lessons, frankly, through old wives' tales and whatnot, that tell you to distrust doctors, and that's keeping some folks from getting tests. That's keeping some folks from maybe, going to seek treatment. And that may be playing a little bit also into this. So this is something that we need to do more study and more journalism about. So this is something that we should also be discussing as well. AP had a recent report about this, talking about how historic failures in government responses to disasters and emergencies. We should also throw in things like the Tuskegee experiment into this. Medical abuse, neglect, and exploitation have jaded generations of Black people into a distrust of public institutions. So we really should understand that this doesn't come from just nowhere. This isn't something that's just invented. We really need to understand how COVID-19 has not just come out of nowhere to say these Black disparities of death are it's just happening out of nowhere. No, it's exacerbating what was already here. The holes in the boat were already present. The boat was sinking. And now these things are revealing faults that were already here. So what we need to do is say, look, these, health disparities, such as, Black maternity. We had issues, ProPublica, reported last year that Black women were dying in pregnancy and childbirth at alarmingly disproportionate rates. We need to talk about how to fix these things. And right now, we have an administration, unfortunately, I can say this because I'm an opinion journalist, we have an administration right now that isn't talking about solutions. They seem to be talking about how to blame these communities for the problem. And right now, just as recently as this Sunday, we have Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar on CNN talking about how those same comorbidities that I mentioned are to blame for these high, these high death tolls. Frankly, we need to be looking about how this administration is contributing to those comorbidities, and we need to be looking about how to reverse that, and not about how to lay the blame on particular communities. This is something we need to talk about. We need to talk about accountability here, and frankly, we need to talk about how to enhance, journalism and contribute to journalism in this environment, so that we can so we can really make sure that all these folks who are responsible are in fact held accountable. We can't, in this environment, as much as journalism is suffering and as much as people are suffering, afford to let that slide.
Thanks so much for that, Jamil. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of the work that you're doing, particularly when you're working in a profession like many others, where folks like yourself are tremendously underrepresented and we aren't in a position to tell the kinds of stories that you're telling, and holding people accountable, and data and reporting are very, very important. So with that said, before I want to bring everybody together here so we can open it up. I know we're going to open it up for comments and questions, and kind of where do we go from here. But I do want to remind our viewers that this is being recorded. And so folks can come back later to the Raben Group YouTube channel and view it, and hopefully share it with others as they see fit. So with that said, I wanted to go, I guess, more open-ended, sort of, where do we go from here? And one of the things we talk a lot about is, this has been well documented. I know many of you have probably been on a number of webinars since this has all begun and been asked for your opinions on various issues, but we did want to have sort of a forward-looking vision as well. So it's important, you all gave a context, I think, to our audience, sort of, what has happened, why it's happened, where do we go from here, I think is an important thing. And also, how can people get involved? How can they have their own impact? Oftentimes, we're all sitting back and say, well, I'm just one individual, what sort of impact can I have? But I think connecting with folks like Jamil, connecting with organizations like NALCAP or HIP or OFN to tell your story about, I thought, hey, OFN, I thought I was going to get this money, but it didn't happen for me, and here's why. Now you have more information that you can then go and turn around. So let's open that up. Let me maybe start, Eeny Meeny. How about, let's start with you, Noel, sort of what your experiences have been and where you see we go from here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of focus on federal policy right now. There is a CARES 2.0, sort of the HEROES bill that was passed in the House. And I think a lot of important debate around that and some important provisions in that. But I feel like it's very important to remember that this is not purely a federal policy question. So we need to be investing today, right? Immediately. And the federal government can play a really important role in setting the balance of that investment, showing leadership in that. But the truth is for many communities of color right now, we simply can't trust that the federal budget is going to save our communities because it is being directed within administrations in each of the federal departments and responsible for implementing these policies that in many cases either doesn't fully understand how to land these resources in our communities, or unfortunately in some cases prefers not to. And so I think thinking about, as Anamari was talking about, philanthropic investment, thinking about how capital is flowing through our financial system and holding that accountable. Really thinking about how we build our own institutions and control capital in our neighborhoods, whether we're talking about CDFIs, like the organizations that Lisa so expertly represents, or whether we're talking about even just sort of community-based groups that are coming together, building our own capacity, taking control of our own neighborhoods. This is the place where I focus my work, and I think is, again, we hope for great outcomes from the federal government, but I ain't holding my breath.
So let me, if I may, connect back to Anamari, because I wanted to dive a little bit deeper. I know that you're not necessarily engaged on the federal level, but I do want to bring in the thought or the idea that our policymakers, particularly policymakers of color, play a role in promoting philanthropy, right? And so I also want to connect that to the piece that you referenced, the New York Times piece. I know it's difficult to find a silver lining perhaps right now, but is that maybe a silver lining? I mean, one of the thoughts within the piece was, it's unfortunate that this had to happen for this to come to light, and people have been talking about it. But the fact that, it's in a New York Times piece, and are people talking about it, or is it just sort of another one of those things that goes away? And the second part is, how can we get more of our policymakers, because they are engaged on the PPP and the HEROES and all of that, but how can we get them more engaged in the work that you do?
Lots of questions there. So I was happy to see the New York Times article, but there have been New York Times article on this before, over and over and over. And I mean, we call it philanthropic redlining. And we've been calling it that for years. So it's not anything new. I think the buck stops with foundation trustees, because foundations trustees are not willing to take the chance that they need to. And if the foundation trustees are playing it safe and hiring based on the CEOs based on personal relationships and who they perceive as less risky, that then there's a whole pipeline of less risky choices that are made. And that's what happens. In the end, organizations of color are perceived to be riskier. That's why when they do get money, they get money that is tends to be project dollars instead of general operating dollars. So what we see is that organizations that are run by people of color are underfunded, they have smaller budgets, they have smaller staff, and critically, they have smaller operating or reserve funds. And that is very much of a concern during a pandemic and during a financial crisis, or when we need to be taking risks like we need to right now, because right now it's not normal operating times. These are times that are very unusual. And so organizations need to receive dollars that are much more general. And there have been a lot of great foundations. 460 signed a pledge last month saying, we're going to step it up. We're going to be much more flexible. We're going to do more of increased payouts, but that's not enough during a pandemic. We need more monies. I mean, CDFIs, we have 2 here, rely on both on the grant making side, but they also rely on PRIs, which is the endowment side. And that's really where the monies are. And so we need to figure out how in a win-win scenario we open up more of those dollars. In the end, I really like what Noel said, because I mean, from our perspective, Hispanics in Philanthropy started as just a network of foundations, right? And we could have stayed just doing that, asking for more accountability and more transparency within the sector. But we realized that no one sector can do it alone. So yes, the government is doing what it can and it needs to do more, but foundations need to do more, and us as individuals need to also have ways that we can also provide dollars, so that collectively adds up to a lot.
I wanted to go to a point that Jamil made, but before I do that, Lisa, I think something just popped into my mind as it relates to, you know, sort of this whole congressional and the thought process about why policy happens the way it does, why the PPP was created, and so forth. CDFIs, I mean, it feels like they should have a voice in the fact that, as you mentioned, for 25 years, this has been a fund, right, as part of the Treasury Department.
Correct.
Is that entity able to go to the Treasury Secretary and say, you know, hey, a really great way to ensure that money is going to get to the communities that need it is by making sure we're fully funded and getting the kind of money that we need, rather than, you get where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have a reaction to that or not.
We're pretty sure they already did. And I had a chance to speak directly with Treasury officials and the CDFI fund director at the time. We just think this moment of partnership needs to be taken more seriously. And I think what both Ana Marie and Noel are saying is that there is a role for private partners, no question. You cannot fix the communities we're talking about without partnership that's both private and philanthropic and the impact investors. But at a moment when the government is going to spend trillions of dollars, this is a moment for the infrastructure that is going to be rebuilt in this country. And that's where we belong as well. So here's where I don't think we can let the federal government off the hook. And as you said, Larry, there is a CDFI fund. And what we're saying is, in this next act, the Democratic Heroes Bill says $1 billion. We're in the trillions now, over $3 trillion. And we're saying 1 billion of it ought to be an emergency appropriation, which is the kind of baseline funding that translates into the jobs and the facilities and the housing that all of our communities are going to need. And I think we can't, I liked Noel's point that it's not, pobrecito. No, it's that the country needs us to succeed.
Absolutely.
This is what this revealed. You can't leave out 90% of the folks who need the funds and expect that we're all going to march forward. We don't. And so we want the bodega to have a shot at coming back. We've got too many food deserts in this country. We can't just give up and say they're done. So what we are saying is that part of the partnership, we'll take every dollar of federal money and we will match it with those private dollars, the ones that Ana Marie is talking about, the impact dollars, the Google funds, the regular bank lending, and we'll make that move. And this is what's going to happen when we all get out of our living rooms and start returning to, business. We're going to be the ones who listen to those businesses. a lot of businesses aren't going to come back in the exact same way. They'll need a lender who will take them to the next stage of their business. It's going to have to be repurposed, or they're going to have to do a refinancing, or they're going to have to do something more creative. And that's where we need this level of businesses where it is smaller and it is more, it doesn't have big tax accountants and big lawyers to reorganize, to quietly sit with them and help them move forward. And that's where I think the partnership that we need. But I'm not willing to let the federal government out of the hook. Treasury knows what's down the hall. It's a fantastic staff that can do a quick appropriation to really prepare us for what's next, which is how do we walk out of this? How do we move forward?
I can't envision America succeeding without communities of color succeeding, for sure. So, Jamil, I wanted to come back to you, and I think one of the pieces that stuck with me is sort of the cultural piece, and that is, I know this is very true for the Latino community, is, we don't want to go to the doctor. I was telling a member of my family that it sounds like a funny joke from George Lopez. It's actually an awful joke in the context of this, but he would always talk about Latinos would tell each other, hey, you better not go to the doctor because they might find something wrong with you. But, it's real, right? And it's kind of like, it's a really sad commentary. I mean, again, he meant it as comedy, but, where do we go from here to ensure that folks are getting, the kind of care that they need? There's a role for advocacy organizations, obviously. There's a role for our members of Congress, the CBC, the CHC, the Tri-Caucus. What are you kind of seeing out there in terms of folks stepping up, trying to speak to our community about the need to go and get the kind of healthcare that they need?
Well, I think first things first. I think certainly those tropes. I hate to use this verb, but I think those tropes need to die. Certainly, we need to do some cultural work within our communities, Black, Latino, and other communities of color to, say, hey, going to the doctor is important. Going to the doctor is necessary. And, but at the same time, while we do that, we need to also say the fact that we're not going to the doctor is not why we have this problem right now. Let's not lay this all at the feet of our own insecurities about medical care, and understand why we have those insecurities, number one. So I think, just also to Lisa's point about, getting the federal government involved and not letting them off the hook, I think it's really important that we have the CBC and other forces really, get into our communities and emphasize first things first. I think above all, tell our communities to make sure that they are counted, not just in terms of the vote in November, but also in terms of the census right now, because the dollars are not going to come to those communities if they are not filling out the census. So we need to make sure that the census is completed. And I understand how difficult it is right now with coronavirus. Folks are not knocking on doors, the census takers are not out in the neighborhoods, but we had to make sure that folks are getting those census forms completed. And I think it's really, really important that, as much as people are able, make sure that their stories are being told. And that means, make sure that they're calling up local media and letting people understand, telling their stories. And I understand that that's, a plug for my business, but, people are not going to understand the depths of what is going on, from on a personal level, if we are not telling our stories. And if that means calling up your local representative and telling her or him what is going on in your community, and that local representative can then get stories out to journalists like myself, that stuff happens. Say, hey, I get calls from people in Congress or state representatives all the time saying, hey, these particular folks in my district are going through this or that, and we have this people who are willing to talk to you about this particular issue. This kind of stuff happens. You can reach people like me and have your story told if you reach out to your elected representatives. It is a conduit. So understand that, that kind of thing gets change made. Journalism is a pathway towards change. So I think that we need to use every avenue that we can, and as much as local journalism especially has suffered during this pandemic, incredible job losses that we've seen. I think we need to make sure that we use that the best we can.
For sure, and I understand. Imagine voter registration is a very, very difficult task right now. We've got a lot of folks that we need to register for the upcoming election. So,
indeed.
Yeah. So it looks like we have a couple questions. It's like some good stuff here. You've highlighted that we have a long-term tragedy run into a short-term crisis, and vulnerable people bear the brunt. What can we do to foster a community response that lifts the whole community?
So I might jump in on this one. This is what I do for a living. This is not volunteer work, right? This is what we do with our lives. That's to say, this is a profession, going and addressing the economic needs or the health needs or pick what it is, right? Investing in the opportunities that are in our community. And so those who spend time on the weekend doing this work are good. And those who volunteer 10 times a month, even better. But those who spend their lives telling these stories, making these investments, advocating on behalf of their community for their life, those are the indispensable ones, right? And so I think it's and that doesn't mean that all of us have to become, community development professionals. I think people sitting in many seats in this country, in industry, in nonprofits, in government, in journalism, media, can all play their role in this. And so I think there's an accountability that we must own. When we leave college or when we get a resource and make it ahead a little bit, it's that idea of, well, I'm going to make mine and then I'm going to come back and give back later. Well, there's no time like the present, right? And so I think it does come down to us choosing to spend our lives with this as a primary concern. I think that maybe had been lost in the go-go days of the economy. Certainly before the Great Recession, and even it felt like after the Great Recession, as things began to improve, a little bit more of this, well, get yours in the economy. And I think we may have to get back to thinking a little bit more about how we, at a community level, create conduits for capital, tell our stories, and do all these things that my colleagues here have talked about.
Larry, can I just jump in?
Sure,
I just think that this is a community development moment, and that what the question highlights, when you have a long-term tragedy and a short-term crisis and the vulnerable, we do need a community response. And this is, it was a little out of fashion, perhaps, to talk about the profession of community development and what we really needed. But I think if anything, and having to be in our homes or sheltering with, Zoom and whatever tech we've got, it is revealed that communities, grow and thrive together. And we need this community development moment. We actually know something about how to make a channel for capital, about how to lift the health centers and the housing and the small businesses all together. We've learned something over the last 30 years. This is a field that's evolved. And I think when we know we've got these kind of long-term trends that are so apparent now in a short-term crisis, it's the time to reinvest and to say that we've got some pillars who want to go back in, who know how to lend, who know how to be the partners. And it is it's this partnership field, this community development field, which is this partnership between nonprofits and philanthropy and the private sector and government. So I just wanted to echo that. I
appreciate that.
I think the tragedy does reveal where our power is in this moment.
Can I jump in?
Sure, absolutely, please do.
I've also seen, even though many of us have experienced economic hardship, and it's a really difficult time. I've also seen the incredible generosity of the American people that's come out in the last 2 months. For Cinco de Mayo, we had a big concert to benefit essential workers and farm workers specifically, and we raised $1.5 million by give 5 on 5, $5 at a time. We got to that number, and we've been running. HIP has a crowdfunding platform, HIP Give. And we've been seeing people just giving so much to organizations in their communities, because people are seeing that their organizations, their nonprofits are really being disinvested, and they want to see them succeed. We're just launching a Power Up Fund to help and to complement what's happening with the CDFIs, and the Power Up Fund is going to help those businesses that are small, between 2 and 10 persons, that maybe can't, they definitely can't get PPP, and they maybe are not ready for the CDFIs. And how do we get them ready? So get an ecosystem, a whole pipeline going. But it takes all of us. It's not just the government. It's not just foundations. I really feel like as co-investors, if we all come together collectively, it's super powerful.
All right, next question. So we got a question here. Hello, I'm a filmmaker from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm currently producing a web series to renovate small bodegas and highlight food insecurity. How can bodegas survive? Most are cash-based businesses.
Yeah. I'll pop in and Noel too. That's one of the kind of businesses that CDFIs specialize in supporting. So if I don't know who you're working with in Boston, but please go to the OFN website and make sure that we're connecting these kind of businesses with CDFIs. You know, it's also a tradition around healthy food that the CDFIs have been working to make sure those small bodegas do get the kind of upgrades, you know, so that they can have better refrigeration, so that they can have fresh food that's brought into the communities. I think that was activities that were advanced heavily in the last administration, but I think there's definitely, I think we can't give up. This is part of the food distribution network that exists in urban communities. And I think there are lenders ready to help. And again, that was one of the facilities of the Federal Treasury CDFI Fund, was to run a healthy food financing initiative, so that there were resources for the kind of lower interest long-term loans that could reach those bodegas.
Yeah, Evelyn's question here is far more than a question about one business or even one sector of the Boston economy. And it's a macroeconomic question she's asking. How in this country do we make sure that bodegas can survive? And other businesses of that size, of that value, of that cultural import in our community? And indeed, I think the answer to this, while I hope part of the answer does come out of the HEROES and federal appropriations and things like that, I actually think the Federal Reserve has been doing taking some really important steps and need to go further to not simply provide liquidity. It's a bit of a technical point, but I think an important one. Not just liquidity for the banking system, but liquidity that actually makes it to a bodega in Boston, right? And that's not going to happen through the banking system, much less after this crisis has taken hold and broken so many balance sheets, right? And so if it's through CDFIs or other community-based institutions, how is it that we are actually using the enormous power of our central bank, right, to ensure that liquidity flows not just to part of our economy, but in fact to the whole economy? And I know I have had this discussion with the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, and they care about answering this question. It's not a snap, it's not an easy one, but I think this is the next great frontier for the Federal Reserve, is to figure out, how do you help a bodega survive in Boston, Massachusetts?
If I can jump in, because Noel's being very humble. He has a network of 120 CDFIs. I am positive that there's one of those that is serving Boston, Massachusetts. And one of the things that NALCAB does is, not only is it dollars, because I don't think we can only throw dollars at this financial crisis and at the pandemic. We also have to really have the capacity building and the hand holding. There's going to be some serious PTSD coming after this. And we need to be prepared to work with our entrepreneurs and also with our nonprofits and come together as a community to work through that as well.
Great, thank you. We have a question from the president of the Jamil Smith fan club. A question for Jamil. As a communications matter, what's the central message in all this that's not getting out to the American people? Question.
I think there's one central message I would want to make sure that people understand, or at least see through all this, that especially in this rush to return to normal that we're seeing right now, that's being advocated by the president and this administration in several states that are led by Republican governors. We see that, in this rush to return to normal, it's not that, people really missed this, their normal lives. They missed being served by particular people, and they miss being served by folks who are normally in, these service jobs. And who are those people? People who are disproportionately being killed by this disease. And so that's number one. Number two is the fact that, the normal that people are rushing back to is, normal where we're seeing folks, who are mostly white, exhibiting, frankly, very kind of carefree and reckless behavior in public, with a disease that, and essentially not really caring whether or not their behavior affects or can kill, people who are more susceptible to it, or, people of color. And in a way, that's kind of a microcosm of our society. And in a way, the coronavirus is illuminating how, sort of, laissez-faire, whether or not, white behavior, I guess you could say, has contributed to where we are today. And so in that respect, I would say that, take into account how it doesn't have to be intentional. You don't have to intentionally participate in a racist society. You can, go out and go get your Starbucks today without your mask on and be susceptible to coronavirus, and you can be a part of the problem. And understand that that is how America works as well. And once I think you get a better grip on how systemic racism works, and how this virus is illuminating how that works, I think maybe you'll maybe want to be a better part of the solution.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. I think we have time for one more, so we can get in one more here. What can individuals do to ensure organizations we care about, as well as underserved communities, get a fair share or shot at any additional federal funding?
Yeah.
So this gives us our way forward here.
Yeah. I'll kick it off, because I think this is a moment to use our democracy. This is, at the federal level, this is a historic moment of huge resources going through. And it's already been shown that that Congress is listening. And I mean, on both sides of the aisle, they made the original thing better because it was so grossly unfair. And I think it would not have been clear to folks how unfair it was if individuals had not shouted. So I say lean in. There's some big ideas now that you can support. They should be embraced on both sides of the aisle. And we need to insist on it. And the HEROES Act made a good first step at this. And I think it's our moment to use the channels we've got and make sure we move these things forward. There are good ideas in this now.
Noel, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'll just say, as the cynic who earlier said I'm not holding my breath about our federal response, I can only agree with Lisa about using our voice, using our democratic strength, and ultimately using our vote. But I think it matters right now how strongly we advocate. Whether we win or lose on something, on some provision of the HEROES Act or CARES Act or what have you, I think it's incredibly important for laying the groundwork for the next Congress and the next and the next. We're in this for a long haul. So I can't but agree with what Lisa's saying. Use that vote.
Marie, 30 seconds.
So there's still 100 billion left in the second round of PPP, but according to CRL, 91% of Latino businesses stand no chance of accessing those dollars. So I'm also a little bit of a cynic. So I'm going to go the route of multiplying our power through our collective giving. And that means really pushing on foundations to do better, to do payout that's more than 5%, and also our own communities, because right now we're invisible as givers. And I think if we do collective giving, we can go to foundations as co-investors with our own funds and push them to do more and better.
Jamil, you get the opportunity to leave us with something inspirational.
Yeah, that's my specialty. I think that what we should do is make sure, obviously, I'll echo the call to vote. Make sure, again, fill out your census. And I would say make sure you subscribe to your local newspapers. I mean, folks, local newspapers are dying by the dozen right about now. It's vital that communities, especially smaller communities where coronavirus is spreading like wildfire, be informed, make sure that these stories are getting told, and make sure that these local papers are getting funded and people can keep their jobs.
Thank you all so much. Excellent point, Jamil. Thank you all on behalf of the Raben Group for joining us. Really enjoyed this conversation. I want to remind you all out there that you can come back to the Raben Group YouTube channel and watch this all over again as you so wish, and share it with others. So thank you all and have a great week.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.